In the winter of '89, when the London fog lay so thick upon Baker Street that the lamps in the hansoms moved like pale moons in a milk-white sea, there came to us one of those cases which, even now, I can scarcely set to paper without a certain discomfort of mind. It is not that blood was spilled, indeed, no blood appeared at all, nor that death made any sudden entrance, as it has done in so many of Mr. Sherlock Holmes's chronicles. Rather, the affair was of that colder, more disquieting kind in which a man's life seems to have been rewritten, not ended, but altered at its very source. Holmes himself, I remember, had been in one of his singular humours. The violin lay neglected upon the sofa, the Persian slipper was stuffed with tobacco to an extent that would have alarmed Mrs. Hudson, and the chemist's table by the window glittered with test tubes like the pipes of a miniature organ. He had been silent for the better part of an hour, his long, nervous fingers steepled beneath his chin, his eyes fixed upon nothing that I could see. I had returned late from my surgery, wet to the knees and chilled to the bone, and had just begun to warm myself at the fire when he spoke, abruptly, as though continuing a conversation that had been running in his own mind. "Your left cuff is damp, Watson." I glanced down, startled. Naturally. The fog, no. Fog dampens evenly. Your left cuff is damp more than your right. You have been holding the reins of a hansom which splashed, and you held them with your left hand because your right was engaged in preserving something from the wet. Preserving something? I echoed. Holmes's mouth twitched, not quite a smile, but the shadow of one. A paper parcel, tied with string, probably a loaf, no, too large for that. You have been to the chemist in Wigmore Street. It is astonishing, I said, laughing despite myself, how you draw a whole little drama out of a cuff. Holmes's gaze flickered to the parcel at my feet, indeed, tied with string, and already steaming slightly from the heat of the fire. My dear fellow, you brought the drama with you. I merely observed it. He rose, crossed the room, and with a delicacy that was almost feminine, loosened the knot. Inside was a new file, its label stark in the lamplight. "Carbolic acid," he remarked. "Still, I suspect you bought it not because you desired the scent of hospitals at home, but because some poor soul at Paddington Gardens has taken to disinfecting the world more vigorously than usual." "How can you know that?" I demanded. Holmes replaced the file with the air of a man setting down a card in a game he has already won. "You are irritated by a smell that clings to your coat. Not your own disinfectant. This is new, unopened. Therefore the smell is external. You have been in a place where carbolic is used in quantity, yet there is no stain of iodine, no trace of chloroform upon you, and your hands are clean, so it was not a theatre or ward. It is a house where someone is scrubbing, perhaps after illness, or after fear. And you have been to Paddington Gardens, because I see upon your boot the pale grit that is peculiar to that square's walkways. A very foolish municipal choice of gravel." I could only shake my head. I have recorded Holmes's deductions before, and yet I confess they never failed to jar me with the same blend of admiration and irritation, as though he were a conjurer who performed his tricks with the air of a man balancing his accounts. "Scrubbing after fear," I repeated. "A pretty phrase. You should write romances." Holmes sank once more into his chair. "I leave romances to those who cannot bear the truth. The truth is always stranger, and frequently nastier." It was at that moment that Mrs. Hudson knocked, opened the door without waiting for our reply, as she sometimes did when a visitor possessed the look of urgency, and admitted a gentleman whose appearance was as incongruous with Baker Street as a yacht upon the Serpentine. He was tall, with the spare, erect carriage of a military man, and yet there was nothing soldierly in his face. His cheeks were hollow, his skin stretched tight, and his eyes, grey and restless, shifted about the room with a nervousness that made me think at once of sleepless nights and private terrors. His clothes were of excellent cut, but worn as if he had dressed in haste, and then forgotten himself entirely. Holmes did not rise. He rarely did, unless a client was a lady in distress or a man who might strike him. He merely inclined his head by the fraction of an inch that with him served as a bow. "Mr. Sherlock Holmes?" the stranger asked. "At your service. Pray take that chair and forgive my companion's fire. Dr. Watson is newly returned from Paddington Gardens, where, I fancy, he has been inhaling more carbolic than is good for a man's nerves." The gentleman's head snapped round. Paddington Gardens. "Then, you have heard?" Holmes's eyes gleamed. "I have heard nothing." "But you have come from there, and your boots tell me that you have walked, not ridden, through the square in the last quarter hour. You have done so in spite of the fog, which suggests agitation. You have, moreover, been in an enclosed room with a coal fire recently. Your hair smells faintly of smoke, and your right sleeve bears a light dusting of soot near the cuff, as though you leaned upon a mantelpiece while thinking. You are a man who has been standing in front of a hearth, wrestling with something he cannot name." The stranger sank into the chair as if his legs had at last remembered their function. His gloved hands gripped the arms hard enough that the leather creaked. "My name is Julian St. Clair," he said, after a moment. "Julian St. Clair of St. Clair House." I confess I started. The St. Clairs were known to all London that followed society matters, for they were that strange blend of old blood and new wealth which produces both arrogance and anxiety. Their town-house in Paddington Gardens was spoken of with equal parts envy and disdain. Their country seat was in Sussex. Their name, so it was said, had once been carved upon the rolls of the Crusades. Holmes, however, received the announcement with no more expression than if the man had declared himself a grocer. "Indeed," said he. "And what brings St. Clair House to Baker Street?" Julian St. Clair swallowed. "A crime." "A crime of violence?" I asked. "No." His eyes flickered to mine and away again. "Not, at least, not as the world measures violence. It is something worse. Something that does not begin." Holmes leaned forward a little. "That is a curious phrase. You must explain yourself with more precision." The man's throat worked. "Last night," said he, "at precisely 10 minutes past 11, my wife Eleanor, ceased to exist." I felt the blood chill in my veins. "You mean she died?" "No." The word burst from him, sharp as a pistol crack. He pressed his hand to his brow, as though to restrain his own mind. "Forgive me. No, doctor, she did not die. She was alive at 10 minutes past 11, and at 10 minutes past 11 she was removed. Not from the room, not from the house. From," he hesitated, his fingers digging into the leather, "from the world." Holmes's eyes did not leave him. "If you speak in metaphors, Mr. St. Clair, I shall be compelled to translate them, and I do not wish to mistranslate your meaning. Tell me what occurred." Julian drew a long breath, as though preparing himself to plunge into icy water. "My wife and I were in the Blue Room," he began. "You may have heard of it, a foolish extravagance of my mother's. The walls are papered in a pale Chinese blue, and the curtains are the same. There is a portrait of my father above the mantelpiece. Eleanor was seated at the escritoire, writing letters. I was by the fire." His voice trembled at the recollection. Holmes's earlier deduction had been accurate to the very posture. "We had our usual supper at 9. At 10 our servant brought coffee. At 10:30 the house settled. We were alone." "Alone?" Holmes asked. "No servants in the room?" "None. The door was shut, as it always is. Eleanor prefers privacy." At 11 o'clock I recall glancing at the clock. It was the ormolu clock on the mantel, French, with a little figure of Cupid holding a torch. It struck 11 as I looked at it. Eleanor was still writing. She spoke to me. Something trivial, a remark about a cousin's invitation. "And then?" Holmes's voice was very quiet. "And then," said Julian St. Clair, I rose and crossed the room to pour myself another cup of coffee. I was at the side table, my back to her, for, he broke off, the words snagging. For perhaps a minute, perhaps less. I heard the pen scratch, I heard the fire, I heard nothing else. He stared at Holmes with a kind of helpless fury. When I turned, she was not there. I could not restrain an exclamation. Not there? She may have left the room. Julian shook his head violently. Impossible. The door did not open. It is a heavy door, Doctor, one hears it. There is only one door. The windows were shut and fastened. It was foggy and cold. There is no second exit. The blue room is on the first floor. The windows look over the square. Even if she were mad enough to climb out, she could not do so without making a commotion. Holmes's fingers tapped softly upon his knee. You are certain the door did not open, as certain as I am sitting here. And the time? You said precisely 10 minutes past 11. Yes. Julian's voice lowered, becoming almost a whisper. Because when I turned and saw the chair empty, I believed at first that she had merely stood to stretch her legs. I spoke her name, twice. There was no answer. I crossed the room. I saw the paper on the desk. Her pen was lying across the page. The ink was still wet. I looked at the clock. It said 11:10. Holmes's eyes narrowed. And you did not hear any step, any rustle of dress? Nothing. You searched the room. I tore it apart, Julian said, and the words came with sudden bitterness. I pulled back the curtains. I looked under the desk like a fool. I flung open the door and called for the servants. We searched the entire house, every room, every cupboard. We went into the square, into the fog. There was nothing. No sign of her. And the servants? I asked. Did any see her leave? They swore they did not. The footman was at the pantry. The maid was mending in the back room. The butler, he hesitated, and I saw a flicker of something like shame pass over his face. The butler was not in the house. Holmes's tapping ceased. Ah, Julian stiffened. He had leave. He had complained of his head. He asked to go. My mother granted it. He left at 10. And his name? Asked Holmes. Silas Graves. Holmes nodded as though noting it down, though I saw no pencil in his hand. Continue. Julian's voice had steadied somewhat, as if the act of recounting had given him an artificial calm. At midnight, he said, I sent for Inspector Lestrade. Lestrade? I repeated. From Scotland Yard? The same, Julian replied. He came at once. He examined the room and he made that little snort of his, the one men make when they believe a thing is simple and only fools complicate it. He said she must have left, and that my agitation had made me miss it. Holmes's lip curled slightly. A comforting theory. Lestrade said perhaps she had gone to meet someone. That she had run off. He said, Julian's knuckles whitened on the chair arms. He said perhaps she was not as content with her marriage as I believed. He implied, he suggested. The man broke off, swallowing. Holmes regarded him with a sudden sharpness. And what do you believe, Mr. St. Clair? Julian's grey eyes fixed upon Holmes's face with desperate intensity. I believe, he said slowly, that my wife has been stolen, not her body, not her person, but her existence. This morning, he fumbled in his coat and drew out a sheaf of papers, some folded, some crumpled. This morning, Mr. Holmes, I attempted to go about the ordinary business of a man whose wife is missing. I went to the police station. I asked for her description to be circulated. They asked me for her full name, her age, her place of birth, her next of kin. I gave it. He thrust one of the papers towards Holmes. Holmes took it, and I leaned in despite myself. It was a marriage certificate, or rather it appeared to be one, with ornate lettering and the seal of a church. Julian's voice grew hoarse. Look, Holmes's eyes flicked over the document. For a moment, his expression did not change. Then I saw a faint tightening at the corners of his mouth, so faint that any man but myself would have missed it. "The bride's name," he murmured. "It is blank," Julian whispered. "Blank. There is my name, Julian St. Clair. There is the date. There is the vicar's signature. There is the witness. But where her name should be, it is blank." I snatched the paper from Holmes's hand with the temerity that only astonishment can grant. It was as Julian had said. The space for the bride's name was empty, as if ink had never touched it. "You may think," Julian said, "that it has been erased. But it has not. There is no roughness, no stain, no scraping. It is as though the name was never written." Holmes held out his hand, and I returned the certificate. He examined it closely, lifting it to the lamp. "No abrasion," he said. "No chemical bleaching visible to the naked eye." "Interesting." Julian seized another paper. "Her letters," he said. "Her letters to her sister. Look at them." He flung one across. I picked it up. It was dated the previous month. The handwriting was delicate, feminine. The letter began, "My dearest Margaret, I cannot tell you," and then, where a name should have been signed at the end, there was nothing. Not a blot, not a dash, nothing at all. Julian's breathing quickened. "This morning I went to the family solicitor, Mr. Pritchard. I asked him for Eleanor's settlement papers. He looked at Holmes as if expecting mockery for such a cold detail amid panic. I know how it sounds. But I needed proof. I needed something that said she was. Pritchard opened the safe and drew out the papers. Her name was not there either. It was as though she had never existed. Holmes's gaze grew abstract, distant, those strange moments when his mind seemed to withdraw from the room and move among invisible threads. "And the household?" he asked. Julian's voice dropped. "The household, Mr. Holmes. The household behaves as though I am mad. The servants remember her in the moment. If I point to her portrait, they say, 'Yes, madam.' But when I asked the cook this morning when she last spoke to my wife, she frowned and said, 'Your wife, sir?' as though the phrase itself were a novelty. When I told them to lay out Eleanor's dresses, the maid said, 'Which lady's dresses, sir?' 'My mother.' His voice broke at last. 'My mother says I have never been married.' A silence fell in our little sitting room that was broken only by the soft hiss of the fire and the distant rattle of wheels in the street. Holmes spoke at last, and his voice had taken on that tone which always signalled that his interest, once lightly engaged, had now fastened with iron purpose upon a problem. "You have brought," he said, "a case of two parts. The first is the physical disappearance of a woman from a locked room. The second is the disappearance of the woman's past, her name, her papers, her place in memory." Julian leaned forward. Yes, that is it. The second is the worse. Because if her name can be removed from paper, perhaps it can be removed from men's minds. Perhaps, he gripped his head with both hands now, the gloves creasing. Perhaps I shall wake tomorrow and not remember her face. Holmes's eyes softened for an instant, so briefly that I doubted afterward whether I had truly seen it. "You remember," he said. "That is your anchor. Now tell me, what proof do you have that your wife existed yesterday, besides your memory and the servant's vague assent?" Julian's hands dropped. He stared at Holmes as though struck. He licked dry lips. "Her portrait, in the blue room, and in the gallery." "Paintings can be altered," Holmes observed. Julian's expression twisted. Then her personal things, her ring, her hairbrush, her scent. Holmes held up a hand. "Those are objects. They do not name her. The world is full of objects without names." "What else?" Julian's eyes darted, frantic, searching his own mind. She had a scar on her left wrist from childhood. I remember that. She played the piano badly and laughed at herself for it. His voice faltered again. Mr. Holmes, are you telling me that I must prove my wife existed? I am telling you, said Holmes, that someone is attempting to make you unable to prove it. He rose suddenly, his long frame casting a shadow across the hearthrug. I knew that movement. It was the lifting of a hound's head when it catches scent. There is one thing, Holmes went on, that cannot be so easily erased. Not paper, not ink, not memory. Julian looked up, helpless. What? Holmes's eyes gleamed. Cause and effect. If your wife moved through the world, she left traces. If someone has removed the written record, then they have laboured to conceal those traces. That labour itself leaves traces. A man may wipe a footprint from the mud, but he cannot wipe away the act of wiping. He turned to me. Watson, your boots are still wet. Fetch your coat. We go to Paddington Gardens. Julian sprang up. You will come? You will take the case? Holmes's face was already half-turned, as if the client were an afterthought and the problem the only reality. I have not yet decided, said he coolly. Then, with a sudden quick glance that had in it a spark of relish, he added, But I confess, Mr. St. Clair, that your phrase has tempted me. A crime that leaves no beginning is a rarity. And rarities, like strange chemicals, have a way of making the mind most pleasantly alert. I confess that, even in my concern for the poor gentleman before us, I felt that familiar stirring of excitement. For I had learned by then that when Holmes spoke of rare cases, London itself seemed to shift into a different aspect, its streets more secret, its respectable facades thinner, and its darkness more intelligent. As we descended the stair and stepped out into the fog-bound street, Julian St. Clair close beside us, I glanced back once at our rooms, at the fire still burning, at the scattered papers, at the violin upon the sofa, and I had the odd impression, absurd though it was, that we were leaving behind not merely a sitting room, but a point of certainty in a world that had begun to rearrange itself. Holmes drew his collar up against the damp and raised his face to the air like a man tasting it. Carbolic, he murmured, coal smoke, and, something else, something metallic. You smell that through the fog? I asked. Holmes's smile was thin. My dear Watson, the fog is merely a curtain. It hides the stage from the audience. It does not prevent the actors from moving. And so we went, 3 figures swallowed by London's grey breath, toward St. Clair House, where a woman had vanished without a step, and where, more strangely still, the world had begun to behave as though she had never stood upon it at all. The fog received us like a living thing. It clung to our faces, muffled our footfalls, and made the familiar outlines of London appear uncertain, doorways floating without walls, lamps burning in voids, a passing cab reduced to the creak of wheels and the shadow of a horse's head. Julian St. Clair walked between us with the strained, rigid gait of a man who fears that if he turns his head too quickly, the world will fail to keep up. Holmes said little. When he was moving toward a problem, his mind seemed to contract upon itself, drawing in every loose thread of observation and giving out nothing in exchange. Only once, as we turned into the broader road that led toward Paddington Gardens, did he break his silence. You did not tell me, he said to St. Clair, whether your wife's absence was discovered by anyone besides yourself before Lestrade arrived. Julian's breath came out in a pale plume. No, I called the servants, and then it became a confusion. But I was the first to see it. And the pen upon the page, Holmes continued. Was the ink blotched, as if the hand had been snatched away, or did the line end naturally? Julian frowned, trying to summon the image. It ended abruptly. There was a word half-written. Holmes's eyes flashed for an instant. Half-written is a beginning, Mr. St. Clair. Do not forget that. It may prove the only one your case can boast. We came at last into Paddington Gardens, where the bare winter trees loomed like charcoal sketches against the fog. The square's gravel walkways, pale and gritty, crunched beneath our boots. Even at that late hour there were houses with lamps in their upper windows. Wealth does not sleep early in London, and I saw more than one curtain twitch aside and fall again as our little party passed. St. Clair House stood at the northern side, its facade an expanse of dark brick and stone dressings, with a flight of steps leading up to a black door that gleamed wetly in the lamplight. 2 iron lamps flanked it, their flames diffused into halos. The building had the air of those new town houses erected with old money's confidence and new money's hunger, solid, costly, and faintly ostentatious. A footman admitted us at once, as though he had been stationed behind the door since midnight. He stared at Holmes with open curiosity, but his expression changed the moment his eyes fell upon Julian. There was pity there, and something else, a guarded wariness that one sees in servants who have been compelled to take sides in a family quarrel. "Mr. St. Clair," he murmured. "The inspector is still within, sir." "Lestrade is here now?" I asked, surprised. Julian gave a bitter laugh. He did not leave. He is determined, I think, to discover a simple explanation if it kills him. Holmes's mouth tightened. It may, in the end, kill something more valuable than himself. We were led through a hall hung with hunting prints and into a drawing-room whose splendour could not be entirely softened by fog and candlelight. Yet Julian did not pause. He moved as if pulled by a wire, and we followed him up the stair to the first floor. Halfway up, Holmes stopped abruptly and bent, his long fingers hovering near the edge of the carpet-runner. "What is it?" I whispered. He did not answer at once. His face was turned slightly, as though he listened. Then he straightened and continued climbing, without remark. But I saw him glance at the banister, a polished mahogany rail, and his eyes lingered there with that peculiar intensity which meant that some small detail had placed itself in his mind like a seed. At the landing, a doorway stood open. Light spilled out, and with it a faint, unmistakable odour, the sharp cleanliness of carbolic, mixed with something warmer, beeswax polish, and the dry sweetness of old paper. Julian's voice shook as he spoke. "The Blue Room." We entered. It was as he had described, the walls papered in pale blue with delicate oriental birds, heavy curtains of the same hue drawn tight across the windows, a thick blue carpet, a mantelpiece with the ormolu clock, and above it a portrait of a stern, dark-haired man, Julian's father, if I judged aright. The fire had been built up again and burned strongly, casting restless shadows that made the room seem to breathe. Inspector Lestrade stood by the escritoire, his hands behind his back, his sharp face lit from below by the lamps on the desk. He turned at our entrance, and his expression passed quickly from irritation to that grudging respect which he never could entirely suppress when confronted with Holmes. "Well, Mr. Holmes," said he, "Mr. St. Clair has fetched you, has he? A pretty tale to bring to Baker Street." Holmes gave him a nod, ignoring the tone. "You have examined the room?" From skirting board to ceiling, Lestrade snapped. "There's no secret door, no panel, no trick." The lady went out, simple as that. Holmes walked past him without answering and stood before the escritoire. I followed, and my eyes were drawn at once to the paper on the desk. A sheet lay there with a few lines written in a neat hand. The last line ended midway through a word, the ink dark and fresh, as if it had only just been laid down. The pen lay across the paper, its nib glistening. Holmes did not touch it. He merely bent until his nose was close, inhaling like a man smelling wine. "Ink," he murmured. "Ordinary iron gall. And yet there is an admixture." Lestrade snorted. "You can smell ink, now?" Holmes straightened, his eyes still on the page. "Can you smell carbolic, Inspector?" "Of course. The house reeks of it." "And yet," said Holmes softly, "this room was scrubbed this morning. not last night. Julian turned sharply. How? Holmes held up a finger. Observed the sheen on the table legs, the brightness of the brass on the fender, the dampness still in the pores of the wood near the skirting. The polishing was recent. And carbolic, used upon wood, lingers in this fashion only a few hours. Someone cleaned with purpose. Lestrade frowned. The family was upset. They cleaned. Women do that. Holmes's gaze slid to the hearth. Perhaps, now, Mr. St. Clair, when your wife vanished, was this fire as it is now? Julian shook his head. No, it was lower. We had let it die down some. And you rebuilt it afterward? The servants did. Holmes crouched by the grate. He drew from his pocket a small lens and studied the ashes. I watched him, puzzled. Fire is the great destroyer of evidence. I have seen Holmes read much from soot and cinders, but it always seemed near miraculous. He reached in with a pair of forceps from his pocket case and lifted something blackened and curled. It fell apart as he touched it, but not before I glimpsed the edge of paper and upon it the faintest trace of lettering. Holmes's eyes narrowed. He gathered the fragments carefully upon a sheet of white paper. Lestrade leaned forward, interest overcoming cynicism. "What's that?" "Not much," said Holmes, "and yet perhaps everything." He rose and crossed to the lamp by the desk, angling the charred scraps toward the light. A burned document. Recently burned, after the disappearance, I suspect. Julian's face went ashen. But why would anyone? Holmes did not answer. He moved now about the room with that cat-like, methodical precision which I have described before, never hurried, never random, but as though he followed an invisible map. He examined the curtains, the window latches, the floorboards near the door. At each point he paused, his fingers hovering rather than touching, his eyes drinking in every grain and shadow. At last he came to the mantelpiece. He stood before the ormolu clock and stared at it. "Cupid," he murmured, holding a torch. "French." "Quite in keeping with your mother's taste, Mr. St. Clair." Julian's eyes were fixed upon the desk, as if he could not bear to look at anything that might suggest his wife had truly been there. Holmes's hand went out with sudden swiftness. His fingers closed around the clock and lifted it. Lestrade made an exclamation. "Careful. That's valuable." Holmes turned the clock slightly and looked beneath it. Then, with a small, satisfied sound, he set it down again very precisely, as if aligning it to a mark. "There," said he. "What?" I asked, stepping closer. Holmes pointed with the tip of his finger to the polished mantel. I saw then a faint crescent of dust. No, not dust, but a clean arc, as though something had rested there and been moved. And within that arc, a tiny scratch in the wood, fresh and pale. "A movement," Holmes said. "An adjustment made recently." Lestrade folded his arms. The maid dusted. She moved the clock. Holmes's eyes flicked to him. Then the maid dusted beneath it at midnight, Inspector, while the household searched for a missing woman, and the master ran through the square in his dressing gown. Lestrade's lips tightened, but he did not answer. Holmes's fingers returned to the clock, and this time I saw him apply the slightest pressure to Cupid's torch. There was a soft click, so faint that I might have missed it had I not been watching intently. The torch shifted by the fraction of an inch. Holmes's eyebrows rose. "A mechanism," I breathed. Holmes did not reply. He pressed again, and the torch depressed with a spring-like give. Then, from within the clock's ornate base, there came a thin metallic sound, like a catch releasing. Lestrade stepped forward. "What the devil?" Holmes slid a fingernail along the seam of the clock's base and lifted a concealed panel no larger than a visiting card. Within was a shallow recess. Empty. Holmes stared into it for a long moment, and I saw that distant look return to his eyes, his mind racing ahead, mapping possibilities. "Empty now," he said at last. "But not empty last night." Julian's voice was scarcely audible. "What was in it?" "A note," said Holmes. Or a key, or a small file. He glanced toward my parcel of carbolic, which I had left in the hall below, and there was an almost imperceptible change in his expression. Something small enough to conceal, valuable enough to hide, and urgent enough to remove. Lestrade's scepticism returned like a reflex. If there was a note, Mr. Holmes, where is it now? Vanished like the lady? Holmes replaced the panel and stepped back from the mantel. Not vanished, he said quietly, destroyed like the paper in the grate. Or removed to be used elsewhere. Julian made a helpless gesture. But what has this to do with Eleanor? Holmes' voice softened, though his eyes remained hard. Everything in this room has to do with your wife, Mr. St. Clair, because this room is now a stage upon which someone has arranged their props. Your wife may have left it of her own will, or she may have been compelled, or she may have been assisted in some extraordinary fashion. But the greater question is not how she left, but why someone has taken such care afterward. He turned suddenly toward the portrait above the mantel, the stern man with the dark hair. He took 2 steps closer and raised his hand. Julian's eyes widened. Mr. Holmes, that is my father. Holmes's fingertips traced the edge of the frame, then paused at the lower right corner. He leaned in, and his nostrils flared again. Oil paint, he said, old, but here, new varnish. I craned forward. There was indeed a slight difference in sheen at the corner, as though someone had recently applied something. Holmes's nail scraped lightly at the wood. A tiny flake came away. Lestrade gave an impatient sigh. Are we to arrest the clock next, or the portrait? Holmes ignored him. Mr. St. Clair, he said, when did you last look closely at this picture? Julian frowned. It has hung there for years, since my father died. Holmes stepped back, his head tilted, his eyes half closed as though taking a measurement. The eyes, he murmured. What about them? I asked. Holmes did not answer. He moved to the lamp, shifted it slightly, and the light fell across the portrait at a new angle. For a fleeting instant I saw it, the faintest ridge across the painted surface near the right eye, as though a layer had been painted over and not perfectly smoothed. Holmes's gaze sharpened. His hand went to the back of the frame. Ah, he said softly. And then, before either Lestrade or Julian could speak, Holmes lifted the portrait from its hook and turned it around. I saw at once that the back was not plain wood, as one would expect, but had a rectangular patch of newer board fitted into it, secured with small screws. Holmes took out a screwdriver from his case. Lestrade made an angry movement. Now see here, if you damage, Holmes's eyes flashed. If you prefer, Inspector, you may explain to Mr. St. Clair later why you allowed his wife's only certain proof of existence to hang upon a wall without inspection. Lestrade froze, the rebuke striking home. Julian's face had gone very still. Holmes began to turn the screws with swift, practiced motions. One by one they came out. The patch loosened. Holmes lifted it away. Inside the hollow of the frame was a folded strip of paper. Julian made a choking sound. A letter. Holmes held it up delicately between finger and thumb as though it might crumble. He unfolded it with infinite care. It was not a letter, not in any ordinary sense. Upon the paper were not words, but numbers, columns of them, written in a cramped hand. And at the bottom, a single line in ink, heavy and emphatic. Holmes read it once, his expression unreadable. Then he handed it to me. I stared down at it. The line at the bottom was plain enough. For a moment I could do nothing but stare at the words, so stark upon the paper that they seemed to throb with meaning. The numbers above them were arranged in tight ranks, dates perhaps or sums of money, yet they bore no headings and no obvious pattern. It was the phrase at the bottom that held my eye, for it echoed too closely the strange expression with which Julian St. Clair had first come to us. Beginning, none, I read aloud, and my voice sounded oddly muffled, in that blue chamber. Julian's face had gone the colour of the fog outside. That was in my father's portrait? Holmes took the paper from my hand again and held it nearer the lamp. "Not your father's portrait as it was," said he, "as it has been made to be." Lestrade had crowded in despite himself. He peered over Holmes's shoulder with a scowl that could not quite conceal his eagerness. "What is it? Some family nonsense?" "Those are figures, accounts." "Perhaps," said Holmes, "or perhaps they are something far more vulgar than family, a ledger of crime." Julian made a desperate gesture. "Mr. Holmes, will you tell me what any of this has to do with my wife? If there is a hidden paper behind a portrait, it might be my mother's doing or my father's. God knows what secrets lie in old houses." "But Eleanor," Holmes's eyes lifted from the paper and fixed upon Julian with sudden intensity. "Your wife was writing at the desk when you turned your back." Her pen stopped in mid-word. The ink was wet. "A document has been burned in the grate afterward. A concealed recess in the clock has been emptied. And behind a portrait, a paper has been hidden which contains a phrase that matches your own." Julian's lips parted, but no sound came. Holmes folded the strip carefully and slipped it into his pocket-book. "There are two possibilities," he went on. "Either you have, without knowing it, repeated someone else's wording because the phrase has been spoken to you, or you have been led subtly to adopt it. In either case, the phrase is a signpost." Lestrade gave a short laugh. "A signpost to what, Mr. Holmes? Ghosts?" Holmes's reply was mild, but it struck like a pin. "To men who rely upon the stupidity of inspectors," Lestrade coloured. "If you've found something useful, then say it plainly." "I will, when I have made sure it is true," Holmes answered. "Until then, your plainness would merely mislead you." He turned abruptly to Julian. "When did you first hear the words beginning, none, or the idea of it?" Julian passed a trembling hand over his brow. I do not know. It came to me when I tried to describe what had happened. It felt natural." Holmes nodded slowly, as if this confirmed some private thought. Then he moved to the desk and, for the first time, sat in Eleanor's chair. The sight of him there, Holmes, all angular precision, seated in the place where a woman had vanished, gave me an uncomfortable sensation, as though he was slipping into the outline she had left behind. He leaned close to the half-written letter. "Watson," said he, read the last line again. The word she began. I bent over the paper. The last line ran, "I cannot say that I am frightened, and yet there is a..." And then the pen had halted at the beginning of a word, a tall stroke, a curve, the faintest suggestion of another letter. It might have been D, or kill, or T. "She wrote her, and then began something," I said. "It might be a dread, a cloud, It is impossible to tell." Holmes's eyes did not leave the ink. "Not impossible," said he, "merely difficult." The angle of the stroke suggests the next letter was to rise sharply. The pressure indicates haste at that instant. She was interrupted suddenly. He lifted the pen delicately and examined the nib. Then, with a sudden movement, he dipped it, lightly, almost imperceptibly, into the inkstand. Lestrade barked. "Holmes." "You'll ruin." Holmes held up a finger without looking at him. He turned the pen between his fingers, watching the way the ink clung. "This ink is thicker than it should be," he murmured. "Carbolic, as I thought. A drop has been added." Julian stared. "Why would anyone put carbolic in her ink?" "To alter something," said Holmes, and his voice had that dangerous softness it takes when he is nearing the heart of a matter. "Carbolic preserves, disinfects, destroys certain organic compounds. In ink it does little to the writing, unless the writing is meant to be affected later by another chemical." Lestrade stared at him as though he spoke madness. "You're talking alchemy." Holmes smiled faintly. "No, I am talking chemistry, and there are men in London who know more chemistry than you would suppose, Inspector." He replaced the pen exactly as he had found it. Then he rose and walked to the door, where he paused and looked down at the threshold. "What did you observe on the stair, Holmes?" I asked, remembering his earlier pause. He glanced at my boots. "You stepped upon it and did not notice. Come." We went out into the corridor. Holmes knelt and pointed to the floorboards just outside the blue room. At first, I saw nothing. Then, as the lamplight shifted, a faint smudge became visible, an almost transparent film upon the wood, as though something had been brushed there. Holmes touched it with the tip of his finger, then lifted it to his nose. "Oil," he said. "Very fine. Not lamp oil. Something lighter." Julian's voice was strained. "What does that mean?" "It means," said Holmes, "that a door has been oiled recently, this door." Lestrade frowned. "So?" "Doors are oiled." "Yes," Holmes agreed. "So that they may open without sound." The words fell between us like a stone into still water. Julian's eyes widened. I felt my own spine stiffen. "But I would have heard it," Julian protested. "I swear I would." Holmes rose. "You heard the pen scratch, the fire. Did you hear the clock?" Julian blinked. "The clock?" Holmes' gaze snapped to the mantel inside the room. At 11, it struck. "You recall seeing it. At 11:10 you looked again and saw the time. But you did not mention hearing it strike the quarter." Julian's mouth opened. I don't remember." "Of course you do not," said Holmes quietly. "Because you were not listening for it, yet a clock with a mechanism," he nodded toward Cupid's torch, "may be made to do more than tell time. It may mark time. Or it may distract." Lestrade folded his arms, stubborn. "Now you'll tell us the clock hypnotized him." Holmes ignored him. "Mr. St. Clair, your wife could not have left without opening this door, unless she went through a window, which I will presently disprove. Therefore, if the door opened without your hearing it, it was oiled. If you did not notice her passing behind you, then you were distracted by sound, by light, by thought." Julian's voice was hoarse. "Are you saying I was drugged?" Holmes's eyes narrowed. "Perhaps. Or perhaps you were made to look away at precisely the right instant." He stepped back into the blue room and went to the side table where the coffee service still stood as though frozen in the moment before panic. A silver pot, cups, a sugar bowl. Holmes lifted the pot lid and sniffed. Then he dipped a finger into the residue and touched it to his tongue. I could not help protesting. Holmes. He smacked his lips lightly, considering. Coffee, sugar, and bitter almond. Julian swayed as though struck. "Almond? That's prussic acid," I said involuntarily, for the scent is infamous to any man of medicine. "Hydrogen cyanide." Holmes shook his head. "Not in quantity sufficient to kill, Watson, but enough perhaps to confuse. The cook may have put in a dash of almond essence, but—" he stared at the cup nearest the fire. "This one was yours, Mr. St. Clair?" Julian's voice was barely a whisper. "Yes." Holmes lifted it and held it under the lamp. At the bottom, in the thin brown film, there was a faint pale residue, like a ring. He set it down, and something flashed in his eyes. "Lestrade," he said abruptly, "where is your man Graves?" Lestrade blinked. "The butler? He's not here. The family says he left at 10. Holmes's face became suddenly very still. "Not here," he repeated. "Of course." Julian's voice rose, cracking. "Silas Graves is loyal. He has been with us for years." Holmes turned upon him with a coldness that made me flinch. "Loyal to whom? You? Your mother? Or the man who paid him?" Julian recoiled as if slapped. Holmes's tone softened a fraction, but the steel remained. "Mr. St. Clair, you have told me that paper has lost your wife's name. Do you know what else can lose a name?" Julian stared at him, bewildered. "A man," said Holmes. "A man who chooses to be no one." He moved swiftly to the window and drew the curtain back an inch. The fog pressed against the glass like a face. Watson," he said. "You will recall that you spoke of a crime with no blood. It may yet prove to have teeth. Inspector, you will send word at once to have Silas Graves located. He is not merely absent. He is," Holmes' gaze sharpened to a point, "the first true beginning we have been offered." At that instant there came a sound from below, a muffled commotion in the hall, voices raised, the quick stamp of feet. A moment later the footman burst into the doorway, his face white beneath the lamplight. "Mr. St. Clair," he cried. "There's a lady in the hall. She says she's your wife's sister. She's in a terrible state. She says she has found something in the square." Holmes's head turned like a hawk's. "In the square," he repeated softly. "At last." And without another word, he strode from the blue room, leaving behind the half-written letter, the hidden phrase, and the dreadful sense that the fog outside had been waiting for us to notice it. We followed Holmes down the stair with the haste of men whose thoughts outrun their feet. The hall below was alive with movement, a maid wringing her hands by the newel post, the footman hovering uncertainly, and near the door a woman cloaked in black, her bonnet askew, her cheeks flushed with cold and agitation. She was younger than Julian, with the same grey eyes, though theirs were now wide with fear. Margaret Julian breathed and went to her. She caught his hands at once. "Julian! Oh, Julian! Thank God you are here. I did not know where else to go. They would not listen to me." Her gaze flicked from his face to Holmes's tall figure, and then to Lestrade, whom she eyed with instant distrust. "I have found something of Eleanor's." Holmes stepped forward, his manner suddenly gentle. "You are Miss Margaret? Her sister?" "Yes," she said, nodding quickly. "Yes, and I know this will sound mad, but after Julian came to me this morning, and after Mother said there had never been a wedding, I could not rest. I walked the square. I walked it again and again, trying to think where Eleanor might have gone. And then she fumbled in her reticule with trembling fingers and drew out a small object wrapped in her handkerchief. She unfolded it and held it up. It was a glove, a lady's glove of fine grey kid, stained at the fingertips with mud and damp, but otherwise unremarkable. Yet Julian uttered a strangled cry and seized it. "It is hers," he said hoarsely. "I bought them for her myself." Holmes did not touch it. He merely bent closer. "Where did you find it?" "By the railings," Margaret said, "near the southeast corner of the square. It was caught between the iron and the stone, as though dropped and pressed there by a foot." Holmes straightened. "You did not see anyone?" "No. The fog was thick. I only saw the glove when I nearly stepped on it." Lestrade's face had brightened with the first hint of satisfaction I had yet seen upon it. "There we are," he said. She left the house. The lady went into the square, dropped her glove, and Holmes raised a hand. "And yet," said he, "she did not put on her cloak." Julian stared at him. "Her cloak? Yes. You told us it was cold and foggy. A lady does not go out at night in such weather without her cloak. Where is it?" Julian's lips moved soundlessly. Margaret pressed a hand to her mouth. Holmes turned to her. "Miss Margaret, will you walk with me to the place where you found this?" "Of course," she said at once. Lestrade bristled. "I'll come too." Holmes inclined his head. "By all means. Bring a lantern." We went out again into the fog, which had thickened rather than lifted. The lamps about the square were halos of light with no bodies, and the trees loomed like gallows. As we walked, Holmes asked Margaret quiet questions, when she had last seen her sister, whether Eleanor had ever spoken of fears, of secrets, of strange acquaintances. Margaret answered as best she could. "She wrote to me often," she said, "but lately—" she hesitated. Lately her letters were odd. They spoke of nothing, and yet seemed heavy with meaning. She would begin to say something, and then change the subject. I thought it was merely marriage. Holmes murmured something I could not catch, We reached the southeast corner where the iron railings met the stone of the pavement. Holmes took the lantern from Lestrade and held it low, sweeping the light across the ground. "Here," said Margaret, pointing. "Just there." Holmes crouched at once. He studied the stone, the railings, the narrow strip of earth beyond. I bent beside him, though my untrained eyes saw little beyond mud and fallen leaves. Holmes, however, was absorbed. He passed the lantern slowly, then held it still. "Observe," he said softly, "the impression." I saw it then, a faint scuff upon the stone, the mark of a shoe sole turned slightly outward, and beside it, nearer the railings, another mark, lighter, smaller. "A woman's shoe," I murmured. "And a man's," Holmes replied. "The man stood here. The woman stood there." Lestrade leaned in. "She was with someone." "Yes," said Holmes. "But not for long." He shifted the lantern again. "Here, see how the earth is disturbed, but not deeply. No struggle, no dragging." And yet, he rose and stepped back, measuring the space with his eye. The glove was pressed into the rail, as if caught by a hand that was suddenly forced downward. Margaret shuddered. "Forced?" "Perhaps startled," Holmes amended. "Perhaps steadied." Julian's voice was tight. "You said she could not have left the room without my knowing. Are you now saying she was in the square?" Holmes straightened fully and turned to face him. "I am saying that someone wished you to believe she was." He gestured with the lantern toward the railings. "Look closely at the iron." I leaned forward. There, upon the dark metal, was a faint smear, almost invisible unless one knew to look for it. "Oily," Holmes said. "The same oil as upon the door upstairs. Transferred here deliberately." Lestrade stared. "You mean," "I mean," said Holmes, "that this scene has been composed. A glove placed, an impression made, oil smeared, just enough to tell a story to the careless eye." Margaret's voice was small. "Then Eleanor was never here?" Holmes's gaze softened. "Not alive, miss." Julian made a choking sound. "Then where?" Holmes lifted the lantern higher, casting its light across the square. "That is the question which concerns us. But before we answer it, we must ask why such pains were taken to give her an exit from the world." He turned suddenly to Lestrade. "Inspector, when you arrived last night, did you examine the servants?" Lestrade frowned. "Briefly. They were upset. Did you examine their shoes?" Lestrade bristled. "No." Holmes sighed faintly. "Then you missed the simplest thing." He moved along the path, counting his steps, then stopped near one of the benches. He knelt again, this time at the base of the bench's iron leg. "There," he said quietly. I saw a dark stain upon the ground, half hidden by leaves. Holmes touched it with his finger and sniffed. "Oil again," he said. "But more of it." And here he scraped lightly with his knife, and beneath the dirt there was a thin line, straight and purposeful. "A mark of weight," he went on. "Something heavy was rested here, something set down briefly." Lestrade's eyes widened despite himself. "A box, perhaps," said Holmes. "Or a body." Margaret gasped and turned away. Julian stood rigid, his face drawn. Holmes rose and looked about the square once more. "The fog has been useful," he said. "It hides the hand that moves, but it also keeps what it touches." He turned to Margaret. "Miss, when you found the glove, did you notice anything else?" "A smell, perhaps," she thought. "There was, yes, something sharp." "Like a hospital?" Holmes nodded. "Carbolic." Julian's voice was raw. "What are you telling us?" Holmes met his gaze steadily. "That your wife did not leave your house of her own accord, that she was not taken through the square in the ordinary way, and that someone wished to persuade you, and the law, that she did." Lestrade folded his arms, his earlier confidence gone. "And who? Mr. Holmes?" Holmes's eyes turned inward again, that distant look returning, a man who needed her gone not only from the present, but from the past. A man who understands paper, memory, and the chemistry that binds them. He turned back toward the house. Come. There is one place left in St. Clair House which must be examined at once. Julian swallowed. Where? Holmes's face was grave. The place where the servants pass unseen, the place where a man may become no one. The servants' stairs, I said. Holmes nodded. And the rooms beyond them. As we turned away from the square, the fog closed behind us, swallowing the railings and the false footprints alike. I could not shake the feeling that we were walking not merely back to a house, but deeper into a design whose lines were only now beginning to show themselves. We re-entered the house by the servants' door, a narrow entrance half concealed by shrubbery and seldom used by the family. The moment we crossed the threshold, I felt a change in the air, not merely cooler, but closer, as though the walls themselves leaned inward. Holmes paused just inside, his head slightly inclined, listening, not to sound, but to absence. The back of a house, he murmured, always tells the truth first. The servants' stair was steep and worn, the treads hollowed by generations of careful feet. A single lamp burned at the foot, casting long, wavering shadows upward. Holmes ascended slowly, his hand trailing lightly along the banister. Who uses these stairs most frequently? He asked without turning. The butler, Julian answered at once. And the housekeeper, Holmes nodded. Graves again. At the first landing, several doors opened off a narrow corridor. Holmes tried the nearest. It was unlocked and revealed a plain room with a small bed, a washstand, and a neatly folded uniform laid out with almost military precision. The butler's room, said Julian. Holmes entered at once. He did not look at the bed nor at the clothes, but went directly to the washstand. There, beside the basin, stood a bottle half hidden behind a towel. Holmes lifted it and held it to the light. Carbolic, he said, in quantity, more than a household would use. Lestrade leaned forward. Lots of servants clean. Yes, Holmes replied calmly, but they do not keep their disinfectant where they wash their faces. He set the bottle down and moved to the small writing desk by the window. A single drawer stood slightly ajar. Holmes opened it. Inside were papers, carefully arranged, too carefully. Holmes drew one out. It was a folded sheet, creased and recreased, as though often consulted. He read it once, then handed it to Lestrade. A reference, Lestrade muttered. Excellent character, 5 years' service. Signed, he stopped. That's odd. The ink, I asked. No, said Holmes. The date. Lestrade stared. It's dated 3 years ago. But it says 5 years' service. Holmes's eyes glinted. A small error, but telling. Graves has been adjusting his past as neatly as his drawers. Julian sank onto the edge of the bed. You are saying he planned this? I am saying, Holmes replied, that he prepared for disappearance, perhaps not his own, but someone else's. He crossed to the hearth, long cold, and crouched. A faint blackening marked one corner of the grate. Something was burned here, he said, recently. Lestrade exhaled sharply. Another paper? Yes. And unlike the one upstairs, this one was not meant to be half destroyed. Whoever burned it here took care. Holmes rose and turned suddenly toward the door. Miss Margaret, did your sister ever speak of the servants, of Graves in particular? Margaret shook her head. Only kindly, she said. He was quiet. Invisible, almost. Holmes's mouth tightened. Invisible men are the most dangerous. He stepped back into the corridor and moved farther along. At the end was a door more worn than the rest. Holmes tried it. Locked. Julian frowned. That is the old storage room. It has not been used in years. Holmes knelt and examined the lock. And yet it has been opened recently. How can you tell? The scratches, Holmes replied. A modern key, not the old iron one that once belonged here. Lestrade produced a key ring. Let's see. None fit. Holmes straightened. "Then we shall not open it yet." Julian stared. "Not yet?" "No," said Holmes, "because the room is not going anywhere. The man who used it is." He turned sharply. "Inspector, when you locate Graves, you will not find him under that name." Lestrade scowled. "You're very sure?" "I am," said Holmes. "Because the name Silas Graves is a convenience. A man who buries others prefers a name that suggests the same." Margaret shuddered. Holmes moved back toward the stair. "Now, we must return to the blue room." Julian looked up sharply. "Why?" "You said the servants' quarters have told us what they can," Holmes finished. "Now we must ask what your wife knew." Back in the blue room, the fire had burned lower. The room felt emptier than before, as though the night itself had been slowly consuming it. Holmes went directly to the desk. "Watson," he said, "the numbers from the portrait." I produced the paper from his pocket and laid it beside the half-written letter. Holmes studied both together now, his gaze moving back and forth with increasing speed. "Dates," he murmured. "Intervals. Payments, perhaps, but not monetary." Julian leaned forward. "Then what?" Holmes tapped the phrase at the bottom. "Beginning, none." He looked up. "Mr. St. Clair, does your family possess records older than your father's time? Parish books? Estate ledgers?" Julian nodded. "Yes, in the study. My mother keeps them locked." Holmes's eyes sharpened. "And does anyone besides your mother and yourself have access?" Julian hesitated. "Graves did. He fetched them for her." Holmes exhaled slowly. "Then that is where your wife began to vanish." He gestured toward the half-written letter. She was frightened, not of something that might happen, but of something that had already happened. She had learned that a person's existence could be undone on paper first, and in life afterward. Lestrade shook his head. "That's impossible." Holmes looked at him coolly. "It is merely illegal." He bent again over the letter. "Watson, note how she phrases it. I cannot say that I am frightened, and yet there is a—" She was choosing her words carefully. "Fear suggests imagination. She was dealing with fact." Margaret whispered, "What fact?" Holmes's voice was low. "That someone had been erased before her." A silence fell. Julian's hands clenched. "Who?" Holmes did not answer immediately. Instead, he went to the portrait of Julian's father and replaced it carefully upon its hook. "The past," he said at last, "is not fixed, Mr. St. Clair. It is maintained. And there are men, rare, meticulous men, who make it their profession to alter it." Lestrade scoffed weakly. "You mean forgers?" "Forger is too small a word," Holmes replied. "This man does not forge names. He removes them." Julian stared at the desk as if seeing it anew. "And Eleanor discovered this?" "Yes," Holmes said. "And worse, she discovered why." He turned to Lestrade. "Inspector, when Graves is found, he will not resist. Men like him do not fight. They vanish, or they bargain." Lestrade opened his mouth to retort, but Holmes raised a hand. "One last thing," Holmes said. "Search the house tonight. Not for your missing woman, but for any record of a woman missing before her. A servant dismissed without reference. A tenant forgotten. A relative no longer spoken of." Margaret's eyes widened. "You think there were others?" Holmes met her gaze gravely. "I am certain of it." Julian's voice broke. "Then, Eleanor," Holmes's tone softened, but did not comfort. "Your wife was not the first, Mr. St. Clair, but she may be the last, if we are in time." At that moment, a sharp knock echoed through the house. The footman's voice rose from below. "Inspector, a message from Scotland Yard." Lestrade hurried out and returned moments later, his face altered. "They've traced Graves," he said. "Or rather, someone matching him. He boarded a night train. Destination, Dover." Holmes's eyes lit with fierce satisfaction. "Excellent," he said quietly. "Then the end, at least, has not yet been erased." He turned to me, already reaching for his coat. "Watson, we go at once." and as I followed him from the room where Eleanor St. Clair had vanished without a sound, I knew with dreadful certainty that we were no longer chasing a disappearance, but a design, one whose beginning had been carefully removed, but whose conclusion was at last rushing toward us. We left St. Clair House with a speed that would have astonished any observer accustomed to Holmes's habitual deliberation. There are moments, however, when his mind, having completed its silent calculations, demands action as sharply as a trigger demands a finger. This was such a moment. The fog had begun to thin in places, though it still clung in tatters about the lamps, and the chill of the night cut keenly as we hurried toward the waiting cab. "Dover," Holmes said briefly to the driver, and the man cracked his whip at once. Lestrade rode with us, his earlier scepticism replaced by a tight-lipped resolve. Julian St. Clair had remained behind, persuaded by Holmes with quiet firmness that his presence would serve no purpose and might yet undo what little certainty remained to him. Margaret alone had insisted on coming as far as the station, but Holmes had gently dissuaded her as well. "This is a pursuit for shadows," he had said, "and shadows are best followed by those accustomed to them." As the cab rattled through the streets toward Charing Cross, Lestrade leaned forward. "You're sure of Dover, Holmes?" "I am sure," Holmes replied. "A man who intends to cross the Channel does not linger in London, and Graves, whatever his true name, will not risk remaining on English soil once his usefulness here is exhausted." "Usefulness," Lestrade repeated. "That's what I don't follow. Why go to all this trouble? A woman could be killed more simply." Holmes's gaze remained fixed upon the blur of lamps outside. "Killed, yes. But killing leaves a body, a name, a date. This man trades in absences. He removes the beginning so that no end may be properly traced." Lestrade frowned. "You think he's done this before?" Holmes's mouth tightened. "I think he has done it well before." At the station, the night train was already preparing to depart. Steam curled about the platform, and porters hurried with lamps and shouted warnings. Holmes sprang from the cab and scanned the crowd with a rapidity that astonished even me. "There," he said quietly. I followed his gaze and saw a man standing a little apart from the others, his back half turned, his hat pulled low. He held a small valise and affected the air of one waiting patiently, yet there was a tension in his stance that marked him at once to Holmes's practised eye. Lestrade's hand went to his coat. "That him?" Holmes shook his head slightly. "Not yet. Watch." The man glanced toward the train, then toward the exit, and then, just for an instant, his eyes flicked toward us. They slid past Lestrade and myself, but paused upon Holmes, and in that pause I saw recognition. The man moved at once. "Now," said Holmes. We followed swiftly but without haste. The man did not run. He walked quickly, weaving through the crowd with the ease of one accustomed to avoiding notice. He reached the steps of a carriage and mounted them, but Holmes was close behind. "Mr. Graves," Holmes said quietly. The man stiffened. For a fraction of a second he considered flight. Then he turned. Up close, he was older than I had thought, with a narrow, intelligent face and eyes that were curiously calm. "That is not my name," he said. Holmes inclined his head. "No, but it will serve." Lestrade stepped forward. "You're coming with us." The man looked at him with faint amusement. "On what charge?" Lestrade hesitated. Holmes answered smoothly. "On suspicion of administering a poison, of destroying evidence, and of conspiring to procure the disappearance of a person." The man smiled thinly. "Suspicion is not proof." "True," Holmes agreed, "but your valleys may assist us." At this, the man's composure cracked. He clutched the bag instinctively, and in that moment Lestrade seized his arm. There was a brief struggle, sharp and silent, and then it was over. The man stood breathing hard, his eyes now bright with anger. "You are making a mistake," he said. Holmes took the valise and opened it. Inside were papers, neatly bundled, and a small leather case. Holmes opened the case and lifted out a glass phial. "Carbolic," he said, "and something else." He uncorked it and sniffed. "Bitter almond." Lestrade exhaled. "Prussic acid." The man laughed softly. "You are very clever, Mr. Holmes, but you are too late." Holmes's eyes sharpened. "Too late for what?" "For the lady," the man replied calmly. "She is already gone." Holmes's voice was low and dangerous. "Gone where?" The man hesitated, just for an instant. Holmes saw it. "Not across the channel," he said softly. "You have not crossed yet. Therefore neither has she." The man's lips pressed together. Holmes leaned closer. "You removed her from the house, not by force but by invitation. You showed her something, proof perhaps, that terrified her more than death. You promised her safety if she came quietly. And you hid her, not in the square, but somewhere that required time." The man's eyes flicked toward the train. Holmes straightened. "Lestrade, he intended to put her aboard under another name. That is why he altered the records first. A woman without a beginning may assume any end." Lestrade's grip tightened. "Where is she?" The man sighed, a sound almost weary. "You do not understand. She discovered something that could not be allowed to exist." Holmes's reply was immediate. "She discovered you." The whistle blew, sharp and final. Holmes turned abruptly. "Inspector, keep him. Watson, with me." We ran along the platform. Holmes's eyes swept the carriages, counting rapidly. "Second class," he muttered. "No, too obvious. First class draws notice. Third, no." He stopped before a luggage van. "Here," he said. We climbed aboard. Inside, the air was close and smelled of leather and oil. Crates and trunks were lashed in place. Holmes moved swiftly, his hand brushing each in turn. "There," he said, and knelt beside a large trunk marked with a shipping label. He rapped upon it with his knuckles. A sound came from within, not a knock in answer, but a faint shifting, as though something alive had moved. Holmes's face hardened. He wrenched at the latch. It gave with a snap. Inside, pale and shaken, but unmistakably alive, lay Eleanor St. Clair. She gasped as the lid flew open, her eyes wide with terror until they fell upon Holmes's face. Then she sobbed, a sound of relief so profound that it seemed to shake her whole frame. "Mrs. St. Clair," Holmes said gently, "you are safe." She clutched his sleeve. He said I no longer existed." Holmes helped her out and wrapped his coat about her shoulders. "He lied," he said simply. "Existence is harder to erase than he believed." As Lestrade hurried up with the prisoner in tow, Eleanor turned her face away from the man, who regarded her now with a curious mixture of regret and calculation. "You should not have looked," he said. Holmes's voice was cold. "Nor should you have assumed that no one else would." The train hissed and began to move, but Eleanor was already safe upon the platform. As we watched it pull away into the fog, carrying with it the remnants of a plan built upon erasure and silence, I could not help but marvel, as I have so often done, at the peculiar justice of Holmes's methods. For he had followed a crime that left no beginning, and by patience, reason, and an unwavering insistence upon cause and effect, he had forced it at last to reveal an end. Eleanor St. Clair was conveyed at once to a private waiting room, where a railway surgeon, summoned with commendable speed, pronounced her shaken, exhausted, but mercifully unharmed. She clung to her sister when Margaret arrived, sobbing in a manner that needed no interpretation. Julian followed soon after, his face working convulsively as he took her in his arms, and for a little while Holmes and I stood apart, silent witnesses to a reunion so charged with feeling that even Lestrade, practical to the core, turned away to give it dignity. It was Eleanor herself who insisted, once the first storm had passed, upon speaking to Holmes without delay. "I must tell you," she said, her voice low but steadying with each word, "what I saw. If I wait, I fear I shall lose the courage." Holmes inclined his head and drew a chair close. "Only what you can, Mrs. St. Clair. The rest will keep." She took a breath. "It began with the papers. Old ones. She glanced at Julian. Your family papers. I helped your mother sort them, you remember. There were gaps. Small at first, names crossed out in different hands, references that led nowhere. When I asked about them, she grew angry, afraid. Holmes's eyes sharpened. And Graves? He was always there, Eleanor continued. Quiet, helpful, too helpful. When I asked for a ledger, he would bring another. When I asked after a servant mentioned in a letter, he said the woman had never existed. I thought it mere confusion until I saw, she hesitated, then shuddered, until I saw the altered marriage entry, not mine. Another. Julian stiffened. Another marriage? Yes. A woman who had married into the family years ago. Her name was gone. The husband had remarried. No one spoke of her. It was as if she had never lived. Holmes nodded slowly. And you confronted Graves? She shook her head. No. He confronted me. He knew I had seen. He told me her fingers tightened in her sister's sleeve. He told me that a name is a door. Close it, and the room behind becomes inaccessible. He said he could close doors. Lestrade, who had been listening with a grin set to his mouth, broke in. He threatened you. He promised me safety, Eleanor replied quietly, if I came with him, if I allowed him to correct the record. He said I would live somewhere else, under another name, and that Julian would be spared scandal. Holmes's voice was gentle, but relentless. And the coffee? She looked up sharply. He put something in it. I remember the taste, almond. My head swam. The room seemed to slow. He opened the door, and I did not hear it. I remember the clock, she frowned. The clock made a sound it had never made before. Holmes exchanged a glance with me. The mechanism, he murmured. They took me down the servants' stair, Eleanor went on. Wrapped me in a cloak I did not recognize. I remember the bench in the square, only for a moment. Then darkness. When I woke, I was in the trunk. She fell silent, exhausted by the telling. That will suffice, Holmes said at once. He rose and turned to Lestrade. You have enough. Lestrade nodded grimly. And more besides. The man's papers? He held up a bundle. Lists of alterations. Births amended. Deaths advanced. Marriages erased. He's been selling new identities to men who wished to escape consequences and erasing others who stood in their way. An archivist of oblivion, Holmes said softly. Lestrade snorted. The courts will call him a forger. Holmes's mouth curved faintly. The courts must use the language they possess. In the days that followed, the affair unfolded with a sombre inevitability. Graves, whose true name proved to be Elias Mercer, confessed when confronted with the documents Holmes had identified. He had begun as a clerk, a man with a gift for order and an appetite for control. Over years, he learned how records were kept, how ink aged, how memory bent to authority. When at last he realized that erasure could be as powerful as invention, he found clients eager enough to finance his education. St. Clair House, with its old papers and complacent respectability, had offered him the perfect workshop. Eleanor's name was restored painstakingly, publicly, across every ledger and registry Mercer had touched. Holmes supervised the process with a care that surprised even me, insisting that each correction be made in ink, appropriate to its age. Each witness summoned anew. Truth, he remarked, must be restored with the same precision as it was removed. When at last the household returned to something like normalcy, Holmes and I took our leave. Julian pressed his hand with fervour, Margaret with tears, Eleanor with a quiet gratitude that spoke more eloquently than words. As we walked back through the clearing streets, the fog at last lifting to reveal a pale dawn, I ventured a question that had troubled me since the beginning. Holmes, I said, you spoke of crimes that leave no beginning. Is that truly possible? He walked a little way before answering. No, he said at last. Every crime begins somewhere. The trick is to persuade others that it does not. Remove the first line, and the page appears blank. And yet, I said, You found it. He smiled faintly. Because pages remember where words once were. We reached Baker Street as the city stirred to life. Holmes paused at the door and looked back once, as if considering some private ledger of his own. There is a danger, he said quietly, in believing that reality resides only in paper. Men who do so forget that paper must answer, in the end, to the world it claims to describe. He went inside, already reaching for his violin, and as the first notes rose, clear, precise, unyielding, I reflected that if there are those who labour to erase beginnings, there are also those, rarer still, who devote themselves to restoring them. Yet the matter, as Holmes himself observed a few days later, had not quite settled into its final shape. A crime so carefully contrived rarely collapses without leaving behind some sharp fragment, and it was that fragment which soon drew our attention once more. It was on the third morning after Eleanor St. Clair's restoration that Holmes received a thin packet, delivered by hand and without any accompanying note. The wrapper bore no address, only our number on Baker Street written in a cramped, angular script that I recognized at once. Holmes turned it over thoughtfully. "Mercer," he said. "You think he sent this?" I asked. "I am certain of it," Holmes replied. Men who believe themselves misunderstood are incapable of silence. He slit the packet open with a paper knife and withdrew a single folded sheet. He read it once, his expression unreadable, then passed it to me. The paper contained only a short paragraph, written with meticulous care. "You believe you restored what I removed. You did not. You merely chose which absence you could tolerate. Consider how many remain unnamed, and ask yourself whether existence is proved by memory or merely permitted by it." I looked up sharply. "A threat? A confession of philosophy," Holmes said calmly, "more dangerous in some ways. Surely he cannot act again," I protested. "He is imprisoned, his records seized. Holmes's fingers steepled beneath his chin. He cannot act directly, but ideas do not require freedom of movement." I watched him pace the room, his long strides measured, his eyes turned inward. "Watson," he went on, "do you know what disturbed me most about Mercer's work? That he erased people," I said promptly. "No," Holmes replied, "that he did not need to kill them. Society did the rest." I was silent, for the truth of it sat heavily. "Consider," Holmes continued, "how easily a woman might vanish if her name were removed from the right documents. How quickly doubt would infect memory. How readily convenience would masquerade as certainty. Mercer merely accelerated a process already latent." "And Eleanor?" I asked. "She would have been sent abroad under another name." "Yes." "Alive, breathing, and yet gone," Holmes said softly. A living footnote erased from the text. That same afternoon, Lestrade called upon us, his manner brisk but thoughtful. "We've been sorting Mercer's papers," he said, dropping heavily into a chair. "There's something you ought to see." He produced a small notebook, its cover worn smooth by handling. Holmes took it at once and turned the pages. "These are not instructions," Lestrade went on. "They're reflections, notes. The sort of thing a man writes when he wants to justify himself." Holmes read in silence. I caught a glimpse of phrases as the pages turned: continuity, correction, necessary omissions. At last Holmes closed the book. "He believed he was improving the record," Holmes said. "As a gardener prunes a tree." Lestrade grimaced. "Well, the courts won't see it that way." "Still," he hesitated, "there's something else. One of the names we found, one that had been partially erased, it predates Mercer's employment at St. Clair House." Holmes's eyes lifted sharply. "Predates by several years. The handwriting's different. Older." A silence fell. "You mean," I said slowly, "that someone taught him?" Holmes nodded. "Or inspired him." Lestrade rubbed his jaw. "We've not found anyone else involved." "No," Holmes agreed. "You would not. The man who begins such a practice rarely leaves a signature. he leaves a method. After Lestrade departed, Holmes stood for a long while by the window, watching the street below. At last he spoke, more to himself than to me. "Mercer was a student, Watson, a gifted one. But students rarely invent doctrine, they inherit them." "From whom?" I asked. Holmes shook his head. "That is the question I do not intend to answer." I stared at him. "You know, I suspect," he corrected. "And suspicion, untested, is a luxury I do not indulge." He turned back into the room, his manner suddenly lighter, as if he had shut a door in his own mind. "Besides," he added, "there is a greater lesson here, one worth remembering." "And that is?" I prompted. "That identity," said Holmes, "is not conferred by ink, nor erased by it. But those who control ink may persuade others otherwise. That power will always attract men like Mercer." In the weeks that followed, life resumed its accustomed rhythm. Eleanor recovered her strength and her spirits with remarkable resilience, and Julian, sobered by the narrowness of his loss, showed a humility I had not expected in one of his station. St. Clair House was quieter, its servants fewer, its corridors less burdened with secrets. One evening, as Holmes and I sat together after supper, the fire low and the violin once more neglected, I remarked upon the strangeness of the case. "It was unlike your usual affairs," I said. "No pursuit across rooftops, no final struggle. And yet I cannot shake it." Holmes smiled faintly. "Because it touched upon something fundamental. Violence alarms us, erasure reassures us until it is too late. You speak as though such crimes may recur. They will," Holmes replied simply. "Not always with trunks and ledgers, sometimes with whispers, sometimes with silence. The form will change." "And you?" I asked. "Will you always be there to restore what is lost?" He looked at me then with a curious gentleness. "No man is always there. That is why records matter, and why they must be questioned." He rose and reached for his violin at last, drawing the bow across the strings with a deliberation that mirrored his thoughts. The melody that followed was subdued, contemplative, yet threaded with a quiet defiance. As I listened, I reflected that the true triumph of the case had not been the rescue of Eleanor St. Clair, miraculous though it was, but the exposure of a danger so subtle that most men would never name it. A danger not of death, but of negation. And in that knowledge, uneasy though it was, I found renewed admiration for my friend, who, when confronted with a crime that sought to deny its own origin, had insisted upon tracing it back to the one place it could never truly escape, the truth of human action and the indelible mark it leaves upon the world. Time, which has a way of smoothing even the sharpest impressions, did not immediately dull the edge of this affair for me. On the contrary, it was some days later, when the ordinary machinery of our lives had resumed its motion, that the deeper unease began to make itself felt. Holmes, I observed, had fallen into one of those periods of intense inwardness which I had learned to associate with cases that troubled him beyond their apparent resolution. He rose late, paced often, and played his violin not with his customary confidence, but with a curious restraint, as though the music were holding something back rather than giving it voice. Twice I found him standing before the mantel, gazing at nothing, his fingers steepled in that familiar attitude of abstraction. It was on one such morning that he spoke again of Mercer. "I have been reviewing the court transcripts," he said, without preamble, as I buttered my toast. "They are thorough, convincing, entirely sufficient. And yet?" I asked. "And yet," Holmes continued, "they proceed upon the assumption that Mercer was an aberration, a lone man who stumbled upon a method and abused it. You believe that assumption to be false. I believe it to be comforting." He crossed the room and took up the thin packet Mercer had sent, turning it over in his hands as though it were a chess piece. "Do you know," he went on, "what is required to erase a person convincingly?" "Forgery, access, and nerve," I replied. "Those are tools," Holmes said. "The requirement is authority. People forget when forgetting is easier than remembering. Documents do not merely record reality, they instruct others how to regard it. He placed the packet back upon the shelf. Mercer relied upon that. He altered ink, and society altered belief. That afternoon brought a visitor whose arrival sharpened these musings into something more immediate. Mrs. St. Clair, Julian's mother, was shown in by Mrs. Hudson with a look of barely concealed surprise. She was a tall woman, erect despite her years, her manner imperious even now, though grief had carved deeper lines into her face than I recalled. She declined tea and seated herself stiffly. "I have come," she said, fixing Holmes with a steady gaze, "because you know what others do not." Holmes inclined his head. "I know what I can prove. That will suffice," she replied coolly. "My son tells me you restored my daughter-in-law's name." "Yes." Mrs. St. Clair's lips tightened. "Then you have undone a correction." The words hung in the air. Holmes did not move. "That is an unusual way of describing your daughter-in-law's survival." "Survival," she echoed. "You mistake me, Mr. Holmes." "I do not speak of her body." I felt a chill creep along my spine. "You were aware of Mercer's work," Holmes said quietly. Mrs. St. Clair's eyes did not flicker. "I was aware that certain irregularities existed in our family's past. Disgrace, Mr. Holmes, is hereditary if allowed to remain on paper." "You employed Mercer," Holmes said flatly. She smiled thinly. "I employed a man to tidy records. I did not instruct him to abduct my son's wife." Holmes studied her with an intensity I had rarely seen him direct toward a woman of her standing. "And yet you benefited from his philosophy." Mrs. St. Clair's voice hardened. "I benefited from order." Holmes rose slowly. "Then you understand, madam, that order imposed without truth is merely another form of chaos." For a moment I thought she might protest. Instead she stood. "You have done what you intended," she said. "My son's household is corrected in another direction. I trust that will be the end of it." Holmes met her gaze steadily. "For you, perhaps." She swept from the room without another word. When the door closed behind her, I released a breath I had not known I was holding. "You suspected her," I said. Holmes nodded. "From the first." Mercer was too careful, too protected. He required patronage. And he shook his head. She believed lineage could be edited like a draft. "And yet you did not expose her." Holmes's expression was grave. "Because exposure is not always justice. The law punishes acts, not inclinations." Mercer committed the crime. She enabled it. History will judge her more harshly than any court. That evening, as dusk settled over Baker Street, Holmes at last seemed to relax. He took up his violin and played with renewed assurance, the melody flowing freely now, as though some internal obstruction had been removed. "You see, Watson," he said between movements, "this case was never about a woman in a trunk. It was about who is permitted to exist. And you believe that question remains unanswered." Holmes' bow paused mid-air. "It is answered anew every day." I thought then of Eleanor St. Clair, alive because one man had refused to accept a blank space where a life ought to be. I thought, too, of the nameless others whose erasures Mercer had facilitated and whose stories would never be fully restored. The fire crackled softly. Outside, London went on, indifferent yet vulnerable, its countless lives recorded and misrecorded in ink and memory alike. Holmes resumed his playing, and I understood that for him the case was not entirely closed. It had merely been placed where it belonged, not among the solved puzzles of the past, but among the enduring questions that give his work its purpose. For if crime may seek to erase its own beginning, it is the detective's task not merely to find the end, but to insist again and again that every human life once lived leaves a mark no ledger can wholly destroy. In the weeks that followed Mrs. St. Clair's visit, there was a perceptible easing in Holmes's manner. as though some inward tension had at last been resolved, not by certainty, but by acceptance. He returned to his habits with renewed regularity, rising early, corresponding briskly with clients, and once more treating the violin as an instrument of pleasure rather than restraint. Yet I observed that he kept Mercer's packet within easy reach, and more than once I saw him take it down, weigh it in his hand, and replace it without opening it. One evening, as we sat together after dinner, I ventured to ask him whether he expected further consequences from the affair. "No direct ones," he replied. "Mercer will spend his remaining years explaining to inattentive officials why he is not the monster they imagine, nor the benefactor he believes himself to be. That is punishment enough for a man of his temperament." "And Mrs. St. Clair?" Holmes smiled faintly. "She has lost something she valued far more than a tidy family tree. She has lost the illusion that order may be imposed without resistance. The world has contradicted her." It was shortly after this that Eleanor St. Clair herself paid us a final visit. She looked stronger, more composed, though there lingered in her expression a seriousness that had not been there before, as though she had seen behind the curtain of things and could not wholly forget it. "I wish to thank you," she said simply, when Holmes had seated her, "and to tell you that I am leaving London for a time." "Voluntarily, I hope," Holmes replied with a glint of dry humour. She smiled. "Entirely." "Julian and I are going to the country. I find I have had enough of houses with too many papers." Holmes inclined his head. A wise prescription. She hesitated, then added, "There is one thing I wanted you to know. When I was in that trunk, when I believed for a little while that he was right and that I no longer existed, I found that I could still think of my sister, of my husband, of myself. I held on to that." Holmes's voice was very gentle. "Then he never truly succeeded." She met his gaze. "No, and neither will anyone like him, so long as there are people who remember." When she had gone, Holmes stood for some time by the window, watching the slow procession of cabs and pedestrians below. "Watson," he said at last, "do you know why memory frightens men like Mercer?" "Because it resists control," I suggested. "Because it is communal," Holmes corrected. "A document may be altered in secret. Memory cannot, unless each mind is isolated. That is why such men labour to make people doubt themselves." He turned back into the room. "Which is why they must always fail in the end." I reflected upon this as I later set down my account of the case. It had lacked many of the elements that readers of Holmes's adventures have come to expect. There had been no dramatic chase through gaslit streets, no desperate struggle at the brink of a precipice. And yet I am convinced that it was among the most perilous of all his encounters. For the danger lay not in violence, but in persuasion, not in death, but in negation. Holmes himself offered a final comment on the matter some nights later as we prepared for bed. I remarked upon the irony that Mercer's own words, beginning, "none," had become the thread by which his crime was unravelled. "Yes," Holmes replied. He mistook a clever phrase for a principle. "There is always a beginning, Watson. The difficulty lies in persuading oneself that it matters." "And does it?" I asked. He looked at me thoughtfully. If beginnings did not matter, there would be no detectives. That answer, characteristic though it was, did not wholly satisfy me. It seemed too neat a conclusion for an affair that had shown how easily lives might be rearranged by those who never lift a hand in violence. Yet perhaps neatness is not always falsehood. Sometimes it is merely clarity hard won. As I finished writing, the fog once more crept along Baker Street, blurring the outlines of the familiar world. I thought of the countless names recorded and unrecorded in ledgers across London, of lives that brushed against history and left only the faintest trace. And I thought of my friend who, armed with nothing more than reason and an obstinate respect for truth, had stood against a crime that sought to deny its own origin. Holmes was already asleep, his sharp profile relaxed in the lamplight. The violin lay silent beside him. In that quiet moment, it seemed to me that the case had ended not with the exposure of a culprit, nor even with the restoration of a wronged woman, but with a reaffirmation of something easily forgotten, that existence is not granted by ink, nor revoked by its absence. It is asserted again and again by the stubborn fact of being human. And so I close this account with a sense not of finality, but of vigilance. For as long as there are those who would profit by erasing beginnings, there must also be those who insist upon remembering them. Holmes did not speak again of the St. Clair affair for some time, and I had begun to believe that he had at last laid it to rest among those problems which, once resolved, are best not revisited. Yet I have learnt that when Holmes appears most detached, his mind is often engaged in its final and most delicate work, the ordering of conclusions. It was on a quiet evening, nearly a month after Eleanor St. Clair's departure from London, that he returned to it without warning. The fire burned low, and the rain tapped gently at the window, as though the city itself were reluctant to intrude. "Watson," he said, laying aside his violin, "do you know why Mercer failed?" "Because you stopped him," I replied. Holmes smiled faintly. "That is the superficial answer. He failed because he mistook records for reality." He leaned back in his chair, his long fingers interlaced. Mercer believed that if one could control the written beginning of a life, birth, name, marriage, then one could control its meaning. He overlooked the inconvenient fact that meaning does not reside there. It resides in consequence. "In Eleanor," I said. "In Eleanor," Holmes agreed. "And in Julian's distress, in Margaret's search, in your carbolic-scented coat on the first night. Every act leaves a wake." Mercer tried to erase the source, but he could not erase the disturbance. He rose and went to the mantel, where the small packet still lay. At last he opened it and withdrew Mercer's letter once more. "You see," Holmes continued, "the case presented itself as impossible because it denied chronology. A woman vanished without exit, a marriage existed without origin. But chronology cannot truly be destroyed. It can only be obscured. The task, then, was not to discover how Eleanor disappeared, but why so much effort was spent afterward." I nodded slowly. "The cleaning, the burned paper, the false glove. All acts of anxiety," Holmes said. "A guilty man may be calm at the moment of his crime, but he is always frantic in its aftermath." Mercer feared not discovery of the act, but discovery of the method, hence his thoroughness and hence his mistakes. He turned toward me. The oiled door told us the room had been opened silently. The altered ink told us the writing itself was meant to deceive later scrutiny. The clock mechanism told us attention had been deliberately misdirected. Each device was clever in isolation, but together they revealed design. And the phrase, beginning none, I added. Holmes's eyes sharpened. The greatest error of all. Criminals cannot resist the temptation to explain themselves, even if only symbolically. That phrase was not meant for Eleanor alone. It was Mercer speaking to the world, proclaiming his philosophy. And philosophies are footprints of the mind. I reflected then upon the misdirections which had so nearly satisfied even Lestrade, the absent butler. The plausible flight into the square, the suggestion of a voluntary disappearance. Each had been constructed to invite the simplest conclusion, while discouraging deeper inquiry. "You never believed Eleanor had left willingly," I said. "From the first," Holmes replied. "A woman who intends to flee does not leave her pen mid-word, nor does she permit her identity to be erased unless she believes resistance impossible. That belief had to be instilled." "And Mrs. St. Clair?" Holmes's expression grew grave. She was the silent partner, not the architect, but the patron. Without her reverence for appearances and her fear of inherited disgrace, Mercer would have remained a minor forger. She gave him legitimacy and access. But you did not denounce her. No, Holmes said quietly. Because the object of detection is not vengeance, but balance. Mercer's exposure restored the damage. Her punishment lies in the knowledge that her attempt to control the past nearly destroyed her son's future. That is a reckoning no court can improve upon. He fell silent for a moment, then added, "There is one final point which may interest you." I leaned forward. "Indeed?" "Mercer selected Eleanor precisely because she was observant," Holmes said. He believed that by removing a woman capable of noticing inconsistencies, he was preserving the integrity of his system. In truth, he revealed its fragility. A structure that collapses when one honest mind examines it deserves to fall. Outside, the rain had ceased, and the fog thinned until the street lamps shone clearly once more. And so, Holmes concluded, the case resolves itself. Eleanor lives because her existence was corroborated by action, memory, and consequence. Mercer failed because he attempted to reverse that order, and the crime that claimed to have no beginning was undone by the simple insistence that every effect demands a cause. He reached once more for his violin, but this time he did not play. Instead, he rested it against his knee and looked thoughtfully into the fire. "You will write it up, of course," he said. "I already have," I replied, though I doubt readers will find the villain suitably dramatic. Holmes smiled, that rare, genuine smile which transforms his sharp features. Villains who rewrite ledgers rarely satisfy those who prefer revolvers, but the danger they pose is greater. Remember that. I assured him that I would. And now, as I set down the final words of this account, I find myself returning to the phrase that first troubled us, a crime that left no beginning. It was a bold conceit, and for a time it succeeded. Yet in the end, it proved the criminal's undoing. For a beginning need not be recorded to exist, it need only occur. Eleanor St. Clair's life did not resume because a name was restored to paper, but because truth was restored to its proper place, above convenience, above pride, above fear. Holmes did not create that truth, he merely refused to accept its absence. That refusal, I have come to believe, is the true mark of his genius. And so I close this narrative with a conviction strengthened rather than soothed by experience, that while men may conspire to erase origins, the world itself resists such efforts, and that as long as there are minds willing to question what is missing, no life can be wholly written out of existence. For there is always a beginning, and there will always be those who insist upon finding it.